Well, again, I want to thank Lockheed Martin for sponsoring today's meal. And the next event, the final event, the coup de grace, so to speak, is something that has become a tradition out here at West, and it's an opportunity for the service chiefs to join each other with a discussion with a gentleman I think that we're all familiar with, Admiral Jim Stavridis. And Jim has been a great partner to both AFCEA as well as the Naval Institute, serving as the chairman of the board over the recent years here. So again, I'd like to introduce this gentleman and bring him up to the stage. I'm not going to get involved in reading his background and his bio because it's certainly one of terribly tremendous. He's the dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University up in the greater Boston area in Medford. He's been a Supreme Allied Commander. He spent 4 years in that position at NATO. And he's a very prolific writer as well as a prolific Twitterer. Is that a fair word to call? But anyway, this is a gentleman that's been a friend to this event and friend to AFCEA and a friend to the Naval Institute for many, many years. So Admiral Stavridis, I'd like to bring you up to the stage and turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll come around there. Thank you, Bob. Sir, it is an honor to be here with you and with everybody. I will offer that the General said that this event is the coup de grace. Those of you who speak rudimentary French will know that is the touch of grace. It's actually what was used on a battlefield when someone was wounded and you wanted to just execute them. So I hope our panel doesn't end as badly as a coup de grace. Can I ask the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, and the Chief of Naval Operations, please join me on the stage. Please, a round of applause for the leaders of our sea services. Terrific. Okay, I think we got the CNO here, sir. Great to have you. Yeah.
Hey, Paul. Hey, Bob.
And the two commandants.
Sir. How are you?
Sir, great having you here.
Good to see you
Gentlemen,
again.
please. Well, this is an event that people, I think, legitimately look forward to so that they have a chance to hear directly from leaders. And all of you have had just remarkable careers. And I think this is an interesting point because you're all well into your tours. And so this particular panel, this particular year, I think, affords an opportunity that we won't really see again for 3 or 4 years. So with that as introduction, I know everybody knows your biographies. Let me start, if I can, at the highest level, and then we'll work down to some specific thoughts and questions. But can we start with the 2 strategy documents that have just come out? The National Security Strategy from the White House, the National Defense Strategy from the Pentagon. And if I could just ask each of you to say a word about the role of your service in executing those 2 strategies, which I know has been much on your minds. Maybe we'll start here and go that way, and we'll just kind of roll back and forth. CNO, kick it off.
Sir, I'll tell you, we look at those 2 strategy documents, the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy, and we see a tremendous amount of responsibility for maritime forces in general and for the Navy specifically. And if you think about some of the highest level goals in those documents, you're preserving American prosperity, peace through strength, in the National Security Strategy, a more lethal force, building partnerships, expanding to new partnerships, reforming the department in terms of getting things done faster, really. Mm-hmm. Boy, I'll tell you, that as we think about doing business in the Navy, possibly putting out a document that would be the Navy's responsibilities, really the Navy annex to the National Defense Strategy. Mm-hmm. One of the goals will be, hey, for all of this, just let's not kill the momentum that is already moving in the direction of maritime forces for us to execute our responsibilities in those documents. So we see responsibility and opportunity there.
Gotcha. Commandant.
we had more participation in the development of the defense strategy, as you would expect. And I think, I agree with CNO, I think it's a strong statement for the requirement for maritime forces because of the threats. And I think in the defense strategy, they talk about contact force, blunt force, surge force, and I think that's what the naval force, to include our Coast Guard shipmates, we're the contact force. We're out there day to day on patrol, and that we are in contact with our allies and we're deterring our adversaries. But because the game has changed, if that contact layer becomes a blunt layer, in other words, we operate every day in an A2AD environment. It's just not turned on. So when it gets turned on, are we going to be able to survive in that environment? And so I think that's what we're trying to do with the modernization of the force. So we went back and looked at our documents. We had a strategy document we published in 2015. We went the Marine Corps operational concept, the concepts that we have with the Navy, sea power and the other things, cooperative strategy 21, littoral ops in a combat environment, and I think it all lined up very well. And it gave priorities. I mean, you can agree or disagree with what the priorities were. It's a different, but it takes a look at the world in a different way because the world is, the adversaries we have are different than those that we even conceived of 10 years ago. So I think it's a good document. I know it'll change because the world's going to change. It's not going to sit still, and we all have to be ready and flexible enough to do that.
Got it. So you're always in the unique position of serving both in your pure Coast Guard capacity, but always ready to come and fight with us at sea. It's a proud part of the Coast Guard's world. Talk a little about how you see the Coast Guard fitting into this national security strategy, national defense strategy.
Well, look at the two strategies that are out there first. It's only as good as the implementation aspect of that. And if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. And as we start looking at how do we assign risk to this strategy as well? What can we implement, but at the same time, where can we go at risk? Or where can we look at others to close some of those risk gaps? Because quite honestly, the United States can't do it alone. So we do the by, with, and through approach. But then as I start looking at regional priorities, I look at, well, what is not on the map? When you see places like the Arctic, don't see it on the map. When you see what's happening in the Western Hemisphere, the transit zones, and as Jim, you're well familiar with your days at Southern Command, not addressed. So we look at where do we use our unique authorities as a military service, a seagoing service, but also with very broad law enforcement authorities, and where can we close some of those gaps? So we actually have a global, I would call it a campaign plan beyond a strategy, but you really need is a campaign plan to truly implement a strategy. Otherwise, I think these strategies will run out of gas if we're trying to leverage these to resource the best military in the world, here in the United States. So I think that's really going to be the true litmus test. Can we implement?
So let's take it down a level to resources. After years now of sequestration, which has impacted both DOD funding as well as your funding, Commandant. Yesterday, we saw a budget deal moving forward that will, if passed over the next couple days, give a longer-term runway and move the DOD budget, for example. I've seen several different numbers, but let's say $700 billion and $718 billion in the next couple of years. Also advances at your end as well, non-defense spending. So maybe a little bit more resources coming into the mix. Let me start, if I can, down here with Commandant of the Coast Guard and go back this way. You've got defense industry here. Every significant defense contractor in the world represented out here. Talk a little, if you could, each of you, about assuming we have a little bit more on the resource side and knowing that some of that significant part will probably go into readiness and training and non-hardware things, but talk a little about what your needs are and perhaps a bit about how this group can help. Commandant of the Coast
Yeah,
Guard.
I noticed today there were a lot of people dancing in the streets of Philadelphia because they heard that the Coast Guard was going to be funded as a military service.
Yeah,
but-
it's a
but-
big deal.
But 96% of our appropriation is non-defense discretionary.
Of course.
40% of our capital ships are acquired by, maintained by, manned by Coast Guard or chopped to geographic combatant commanders. So we are looking very optimistically at the deal that's being cut that will fully fund an icebreaker.
Yeah.
That will not just restore our infrastructure from a ravaging hurricane season, but make it so it won't fall down. You know, build a house of bricks instead of straw, if you will, approach to the service. But making meaningful investments in a service that the sun never sets on.
Right.
We are deployed around the world, and we're just pulling out of Antarctica today. So it's a good deal for 2 years. I always think back to when Admiral Mullen was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and as he left office, hung up the uniform, and he was asked, what is the #1 threat to national security? Our nation's debt. And so that is a day of reckoning that we have yet reconciled. And so as we're looking 1-2 year budgets, what's just over the horizon? So we need to be looking at that as well.
We do indeed, and not to rain on anybody's parade. We've had plenty of parade talk the last day or so, but we do have a $1.5 trillion tax relief. Now this deal is another $500 billion. So I think your comment is well taken that there's a distance target we're going to have to deal with. But your comments about that near term are spot on and very helpful. Commandant.
Well, they got to vote.
I agree.
And so we've been here before. I mean, the problem is for all of us, and I'm not going to speak for my partners up here on the stage or the other service chiefs, but I'm hopeful that they'll pass. And it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's a lot of money. And we're going to get that money like we did last year with about half the fiscal year left to spend it. And that's not any way to run a business. If they can do a multi-year without having to deal with the Budget Control Act, that'll help us because then we can actually project and we can be more efficient. So but it is a lot of money. And I think as a citizen, we all share, as a citizen, I share Paul's concern about the debt. But as Secretary Mattis said, can you afford to pay for survival? Mm-hmm. Because the adversary out there is making big bets, big investments, and their capacity and capability is growing. And whether they want to take us on or not, I mean, we have to be able to go back to show a capability to deter them. So there's stuff that we want to do. The problem we've had as a military is we've been in an operation since 9/11. It's never stopped. It's gotten bigger. It's gotten smaller. The amount of effort by the naval force particularly, but all the forces, has not gone down, and the gear's gotten older, and we're trying to recapitalize and maintain readiness and get ready for what we think might come and maintain our legacy equipment, and that takes money. So for industry here, all I would say is whatever we purchase, whatever we procure, or whatever contract we write, if we get the stability that allow you and your vendors to have some certainty and you can invest and we take a longer lead time, we understand we need to give that to you. But what you need to give to us is quality product. You know, I buy an airplane or a vehicle or anything, a software package, a ship, it's got to be, we need it on time and it's got to work. And it's got to work with a high level of reliability. And we have to write a proper requirements document. You and your workforce have got to provide a quality product. And so it's a partnership, and we'll work with you, but everybody's going to have to raise their game if we get this money and we figure out how to spend it effectively, efficiently.
Thank you. Chief of Naval Operations.
Well, sir, before I sort of launch into some specifics, I would say that one thing that, just to pick up on the Commandant's comments, is that I think the American people do legitimately have an expectation that we're going to use these resources as absolutely wisely as we can. It is a fair amount of money for sure. And what I can say, one of the dynamics of us serving together for the past 2 years is that I would say that in terms of collaborating together, it's never been better between
Nice.
the Navy, Marine Corps, Navy, Coast Guard teams, this maritime force that's put together. And so there is increasingly efficient and effective ways of doing business, which translate into efficient and effective ways of using resources. And so that's been one of the more rewarding parts of the last couple of years. With respect to any message to industry, one of the things is that we've been talking to industry consistently. To many of the folks in this room, we started this morning with a terrific roundtable with small business leaders, and boy, what an important part of the business they are in terms of the agility and the innovation, creativity that they bring. Need to make sure that we stimulate that. But I will tell you that the most interesting part of that conversation is them pointing out to us where are these obstacles that just don't seem to make any sense anymore in a competitive, globally competitive environment.
Sure.
Coming out of a period of 2 decades or more of really not competitive. Boy, there's an awful lot of conditioning we have to do to lean out our processes. I would say that the Congress has given us plenty of authorities to speed up. We just need the people with the right mindset, the sense of urgency to get that done. Industry can inform us not only in terms of what sort of material solutions can get us better, but also what sort of processes could make us more agile as well. And then we just iterate faster and move into the future.
So let me just run the table one more time and ask you to just comment on 2 or 3 procurements that you think are particularly important, that are working in your lane. So I'm going to guess SSBN possibly.
Right.
But
It's really an interesting question, Sarah. So important for what? Important for national defense, national survival, the replacement to the SSBN, to the Trident class, #1 acquisition program in the Department of the Navy, because without that strategic deterrent, we're really in a different world, right? Everything becomes impossibly hard. So that's got to succeed. If you think about important from a standpoint of meeting the future security environment head on, and so some of the other economic trends in addition to the debt is that it's, the competition for talent is becoming fiercer every single day, and we can't design our systems on a manning construct that's going to continue to require more and more and more people. So that's got to be part of the requirements going forward. And so there are other trends that are going to define this that we've got to build in. So for those sorts of things, some of the work we're doing in unmanned, this MQ-25 is an extremely important program to get unmanned onto the carrier strike group, integrate it with the air wing, and then what's next after that is just as important as well. I would say that some of the rapid acquisition programs in directed energy, unmanned undersea vehicles, those sorts of things are not only reforming the acquisition business, but will put us on the right side of the cost curve in terms of dealing with the future security environment. So those, I think, are some representative programs that are important for very different reasons.
Gotcha. Commandant?
I look at the joint force. To me, the #1 priority is resilient, survivable, reliable command and control.
Yeah.
That we've got to be able to protect our networks and deny our adversary theirs. Because if we can't do that, we're in another space. And I think that's going to be a challenge because of the capability sets that our peer adversaries are developing. And that same thing, if you look at the L-class ships in the fleet, they need to have a comparable capability to other ships. I'm sitting here with the COMU that's going to go out with F-35s, and I'm not sure we're going to optimize the capability of that airplane on the big deck amphib because of some of the command and control. So we've got to fix that. If I look at it as a naval force, in part of a maritime campaign, we need more attack submarines. okay? 'Cause I want to get where I'm going, and he didn't pay me to say that. But I got to get where I'm going, and a bunch of me and a bunch of Lance Corporals with M4s on the flight deck are not going to help me out. Attack submarines. I mean, we have not had. When was the last time we had to fight to get to the fight? We just went. We didn't have to fight to get there. We're going to have to fight to get to the fight.
Yeah.
And the one thing that's going to help us get there is we got to have somebody running a screen line out front. It's going to be aviation, but it's going to be something under the water. And for the Marine Corps, obviously we're trying to recap our aviation, the program that to me is the highest priority, and it's still in a requirements is a Group 4 or 5 UAS that can take off and land from a big deck from an amphib ship that's got the ability to do ISR, do some strike, do EW. This can be on line of sight. And it's got to have some durations on time. The rest of the stuff, I think, we've got 5th generation airplanes. We're trying to create a modern Marine Corps. So the stuff we've had, we take good care of it, but there's Marines over here wrenching on vehicles that are older than they are. And we appreciate their efforts, and we know they're out there, but I would like to give them something. And it's coming. We've got the vehicles, we're buying them, but it's not coming fast enough. So, I mean, I could go all the way down from the boots we wear on our feet all the way up to stuff that's in space.
Gotcha.
So, but those are the kind of the things that, as far as a priority for acquisition.
Gotcha. Thank you, Commandant. Commandant.
Well, we have 3 hot product lines going right now, so I don't need to address that other than to say, we're holding steady requirements. So we're delivering platforms on schedule, on budget, that will serve our nation at least 30 years beyond today.
Yeah.
But we often keep our eye on the prize, and we don't look at what are the sustainment costs as you recapitalize a fleet.
Sure.
And we oftentimes underestimate what those sustainment costs are going to be. And then you find yourself trapped between maintaining and modernizing. So we're modernizing pretty much our entire fleet right now. Which means in another 30, 35 years, we're going to be right back at it again. And typically when we build something new, we use the warranty money on that to maintain the old. We clearly need to build new icebreakers. And with the budget deal, this will finally put real money to at least build the first one. We have an integrated program office with the Navy up and running, driving down costs, meet requirements. We haven't built one in 40 years.
Yeah.
It's an investment in our shipbuilding industry here in the United States. Hold that thought for just a minute, though. At one of these events, someone asked me about the Jones Act. They said, well, should we get rid of the Jones Act? As soon as we get rid of the Jones Act, NASCO is going to go away. Our ability to build ships here in the United States and the technology is going to go away. But you start looking at these campaign plans, let's not lose sight of sea lift. Our ready reserve fleet is very old. Many of these are steamships. We're running out of licensed mariners that know how to run these ships, but we have plans that are built, to Bob's point, that they'll all arrive on time and there will be no attrition. It's probably not a good assumption to make. So we can't lose sight of the fact of logistics and sea lift, and so I see a vulnerability there as well. The other area we're looking at, we have another fleet that maintains our inland waterways. And so if you're going to say you need something, you need to just explain why, not what. So why? It moves $4.6 trillion of commerce that will not move if these waterways are not properly maintained. Now, in my checkbook, that's real money, $4.6 trillion for a very modest investment of $15, $18 million a copy ships to reconstitute ships that are 73 years old right now. Not a huge ask. But a huge return on investment as well. And then the last area I look at is, as we operate much north of 65 degrees north, which we do, you're operating in the dial-up modem age. So we need to look at bandwidth. We need to look at bandwidth that can withstand the intent of an adversary as well. So we don't own space outright, and there are adversaries operating in space, so that's another area that I look at that is worthy of an investment as well.
Could I pile onto that just
Totally.
real quick? So, the Commandant mentioned something about, hey, always this balance between, buying for tomorrow and maintaining what you have today. that's another message to industry is we've got to be building in, we've got to design systems that cost less to maintain than the system that it's replacing, right? And so that's not been the trend. We've got to reverse that so that we think about total ownership costs. So from a manning and maintaining standpoint, that load on the system has to go down.
Well, let me pick up on a comment Commandant Neller made, and I'd seen you quoted on this before, Bob, and I completely agree with it. I think you were the first one to start saying we're not in a near-peer situation, we're in a peer situation when we look at China and Russia to some degree. And I think both the National Defense Strategy, National Security Strategy correctly identify Russia and China as potential adversaries. Say a word or two about your service and A, how it fits in that, and B, how much risk are we facing right now? The Commandant says that we're going to fight to get to the fight. I know that he's right. We going to win that fight? I think so, but talk a little about Russia, China, and your service and what's in your head. You want to start, CNO?
Sure. It's a growth industry. I think that the future security environment is going to be more and more defined by the maritime. And not surprising that as particularly the Chinese economy grows, fueled by the rule set that we have established and maintained, for 70 years, they look beyond their shores now to expand their prosperity, and then they're building a navy to secure those sea lines. It's very Mahanian, right? There's no mystery here. But I'll tell you what, they have a very focused effort on this with a very aligned elements of national power. This One Belt, One Road has an important and flourishing maritime dimension, both from a security standpoint and from a prosperity or a commercial standpoint. And in fact, a lot of their things that they're doing are dual use, right? So you could go either way on that. And so, as I said, from those security documents that you described, tremendous responsibility for the maritime. Russia equally well, particularly as they continue to fund and advance in the maritime, particularly their undersea capabilities. And so we've got to make sure that we're responding to that challenge. We set up not only the force structure, couldn't agree with the Commandant more about attack submarines, but also the command and control structure and all those things needed to operate that force.
Gotcha. Commandant Neller.
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say, I'm not sure that conflict is inevitable, but we compete, and the strategy has said compete below the level of conflict. And historically, China and Russia have been continental powers. I think Russia still is in that area, but China is, as the CNO said, they're all over the place. You talk to anybody that's operating in Africa, they will tell you that they're there. They're using their economic power to buy resources and influence. They've expanded their overseas basing, so they've become an international maritime force. So we work with them, but stuff that they've done in the South China Sea, their interpretation of what the UN Convention on Law of the Sea and the 9-dash line, we don't agree with that. But there's a potential for stuff to go bump in the night.
Yeah.
So our ability, if you look at their capability, and they're not recapitalizing, they're building new. Mm-hmm. It's all new. And they have not been consumed with overseas violent extremists, not to the degree we have. And so, they've developed a very capable force, and they're increasing their capacity, using their economic wherewithal to fund this. So I think we look at them as a pacing threat. Mm-hmm. And so I think our ability, that's why it's so important that much of the stuff that the CNO talked about and we've talked about in all the services, to try to be able to ensure that if they did, that their calculations are based on the fact that they're not going to have a distinct advantage over us.
Sure.
So that way we would assure that we don't have conflict.
Yeah. Exactly.
So that's the calculus there. So I think we're trying to change the organization of the force. The things that we would need against somebody like China or even Russia is not going to be more armor, not going to be more infantry. It's going to be long-range precision. It's going to be resilient comms. It's going to be electronic warfare. It's going to be information operations. It's going to be the ability to operate within a contested environment, to be able to get access, to be able to get to where we need to get to if we did have to contest any of their actions. And so, you know, it's interesting to watch. You were the SACEUR, you saw what they did, and I think they're very clever. You know, it's kind of like the Chinese game of Go. They put a marble down, and then they wait. And then what are we going to do? And then we don't do anything. If we don't, they put another one down. And I think Russia was playing a similar game. So at some point, we got to put our marble down and then see what they do.
Yeah.
And then maybe they'll, again, it's not good business. I don't think either of us, anybody's looking for a fight, but we can't let ourselves to be put in a position of disadvantage internationally, whether it be economically or other.
Yeah, we can't lose all our marbles.
That's true.
Commandant.
Yeah. So when I look at all the intellectual output of our geographic combatant commands, our functional commands, the joint staff, what's the corollary to that? We clearly need to negotiate from a position of strength, but it's almost unilaterally military strength. If someone were to truly impose an existential threat against the United States, would it wake up that lion that Japan awoke in back in 1941? Could we bring all of our economic might to bear? Do we have the capacity with our military-industrial complex where we can surge output? So maybe we don't need to do it today, but if you recognize, you know, if you harness the entire strength of this nation, you have awoken a lion that will devour you, but we often just look at using military as the only tool of diplomacy. I think it's time we need to start looking at other tools. So we do surge models. Well, what do we do to surge our economy? I'm sure we're not looking at budget caps and sequestration in that environment. At the same time, how much can our military, where is Rosie the Riveter today? She just passed away a couple of weeks ago. But how do we harness, the full output of this nation? That if you want to play ball with us, you are going to lose 9 times out of 10. So I think that's the whole aspect of, we're missing something else in this. Some of the other diplomatic, economic tools to complement our military capacity, rather than to bemoan our readiness. And I think the more we bemoan it, the more an adversary is incentivized to say, as Bob said, we'll put another marble down.
Yeah, I agree with that. And as we look at China, the Commandant mentioned China's movement into Africa. We also see them, another part of the world where they're putting down their marbles is Latin America. To your point as well, I agree, we're not destined for war, as in the title of Graham Allison's book about U.S. and China. But I completely agree. We're fortunately not playing checkers, but we're playing chess, and they are playing Go, and it is a more complicated game. So with that thought, I want to ask each of you a specific question. So Commandant Z, I'd like to ask you about Latin America and what the Coast Guard does for us. Commandant Neller, I'd like to ask you about the Marine operational concept. You talked about that last year. I'd love to hear kind of where that's gone and how that fits. And CNO, you're not going to get out of the room alive without a question on 355 ships. How do we get there? Do we get there? What's the plan? But can we start with Latin America, my old stomping grounds?
Well, certainly, Jim. And I've been trespassing on John Kelly and now Kurt Tidd's AOR. I've met with every president in Latin America, at least in Central America. I've had 4 or 5 meetings just in the last 7 or 8 months as he is leaving office with President Santos. No secret that we are besieged with the flow of drugs from Latin America to the United States. 64,000 Americans died in 2016. That number will be eclipsed when it's rolled up in 2017. And then if you put those numbers into context, you know, how many died on 9/11? How many died in the Korean conflict, Vietnam conflict? But you can't look at this myopically, okay, it's a drug and a drug only. What is happening in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, violent crime has taken over, rule of law is out the window. Right now the prosecution rate in Mexico is less than 5%. 31% of the cocaine lands in Mexico, and then it ferrets its way through our border checkpoints and then into the United States. But you start losing your security foothold in these nations. There's less incentives to provide foreign investment into these economies, so it has a double whammy effect. A security environment that's faltering, an economy that's faltering at the same time, which does two things. It plants the seeds for illegal migration. It also plants the seeds for an internal insurrection in democratically elected nations. So it's what we would call a moderate threat right now, and we normally don't address threats until they become significant or high. But they are trending from moderate to significant if we elect to do nothing about it. So it's a region where, as I look at where the gaps and seams in the National Defense Strategy or even in the draft National Military Strategy, that is a gap and seam, and it's one that we're using our authorities to try to plug some of those gaps as well. At the same time, build relationships. April 1st, on or about, no fool, we will start doing combined maritime interdiction operations with SAMAR, the Mexican Navy, with the Colombian Navy in the Eastern Pacific, where the flow rate is the highest. So it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think we've got some Navy ships coming back into the equation in Latin America.
Yeah, absolutely. We're taking a hard look at
Yeah.
how we can go back and just kind of continue to partner with the Coast Guard in
Yeah.
that theater.
Fabulous. Commandant, talk a little about the operational concept. How's it going?
Well, the mock was based on the fact that, or the premise that we were not currently organized, trained, and equipped to operate successfully against a peer adversary in the year 2025. So there are a bunch of things in there, from how we manage our talent, how we do our training, certain systems and capabilities we needed, how we organize the force. And it involved experimentation, a campaign of learning. I think General Bob Whaler-Walsh came in and talked to everybody yesterday. Probably, I believe, gave a good rundown of where we are in that process. So organizationally, the first thing out the box was the MEF headquarters group, which was kind of your standard compilation of capabilities to support our core level headquarters, the Marine Expeditionary Force. But it was more of a kind of a basic headquarters company force provider. They now have an operational mission. They're involved with the effects and support of the MEF command element. They are going to be more involved with electronic warfare, with cyber, with intel analysis. And so that process is ongoing to transition those headquarters to those capabilities, and finding the Marines and training the Marines that are going to do those types of things, and we're going to exercise with that. Involves exercising with in a non-comm environment, worried about our signature, what we look like to the enemy, how do we mask our signature, make them raise theirs. Capabilities, we got to do modernization, we got to improve our readiness. We're going to try to get more into simulation for our training. We're going to change our training. We're going to go from a counter-insurgency, stability operations training environment to a more conventional peer-on-peer capability set. We're going to do more force-on-force, which we're doing. I just out at 29 Palms yesterday watching that go on, where we use a peer force to fight against ourselves. So it's happening. It's not going to happen as fast as we would like, because one, we continue to struggle with whether we've got appropriations or not. There's certain buys we want to make. It's involved in recapitalization of aviation and ground equipment. But it's really changing the way that we see ourselves as a Marine Corps. It's going to be a Marine Corps that's a little bit older, a little more experienced, because as much as we love our young Marines, like many of them that are here, and we recognize them for their great service, and I appreciate the fact that you all did that, and thanks, Marines, for what you do, and thanks to your families. But we need a little bit older, because it takes longer to learn these skills.
Exactly.
And So we're organizationally looking at the whole way we do business, and it's going to change our culture. I mean, not that we won't have the capability to do forcible entry. We still have to retain that capability, but every one of these fights is going to be different, and we're looking at ourselves against these potential threats and how we might compete.
We'll look forward to following this as it unfolds, and also how it fits into the littoral operations in contested waters, which I think is another enormous piece of this. CNO, talk a little about 355, and when CNO is done, we'll open it up to some questions and comments from the group. Sir.
Well, the 355 number really started with work that we did some of it ourselves and stimulated around the nation to answer the question, hey, what sort of Navy does the nation need to meet its responsibilities in the world? And there was a really, we didn't direct this or try and orchestrate it at all, but there was a great convergence around a couple of conclusions. One, that the nation needed more naval power than we have right now, right? We're just not there. And then in terms of ship count, platforms, there was a convergence around middle 300s, 350 to 400. And so that got a lot of traction and has now been made the law of the land, right? That the 355 ship Navy is in the NDAA. So that is certainly one component of naval power is platforms. As Paul alluded, there are a number of challenges with building a Navy of that size. So our shipbuilding plan, which is going to be submitted soon, it'll start in 1955 in its discussion. And since 1955, the shipbuilding industrial base is now 1/3 of the industrial base it was in 55. There are 14 shipyards that build ships that have just shuttered or gotten out of the defense business. And so you can see these two conflicting trends, the need to grow the number of ships, and you just don't have the industrial capacity to do that. So that's just the shipbuilding part. But as I think of naval power, there are other elements, both material and non-material. So just as important is what do we put on those ships. And so there's sort of a bigger Navy, but there's also a better Navy. And we talked about some of those systems, combat systems, sensors, weapons, et cetera. There's a networking dimension to that. And so it goes to Commandant idea of resilient communications. Yeah. And if you've seen the movies The Darkest Hour, or you've seen the movies Dunkirk, that Battle of Britain was in a large part won by a network of radars that was able to vector the Royal Air Force into combat much more effectively. Then there's this talented Navy piece, and so we've got to continue to bring in the people that will stitch this all together. There's an operational concepts. How do we use this new technology with these new skilled sailors that operate it? And then finally, that's all potential energy unless we take that Navy out to sea with all of those other components and get it ready. And so as we think and conceptualize about building naval power, we've got to keep all 6 elements together. To have one advantaged or one disadvantaged really will create imbalance, which will, in the end, will not optimize that naval and increase that naval power as much as we need. So that's sort of how we're approaching it.
Okay, and you see it as realistic, and as you said, the law of the land.
Very realistic, but I'll tell you what. It's going to be a matter of commitment in terms of resources. So we have a sort of a family of plans.
Sure.
Some that sort of status quo. That takes a long time to get to 355.
Yeah.
If you want to get there faster, there's the current limit of the current industrial base, and that can go so fast. And if you want to go faster than that, we're going to have to build shipyards or think differently.
Or extend service life on some ships.
All tricks. So we're looking at life extension. We looked hard at bringing ships back.
Yeah.
But we're over.
Everything's on the table.
Every trick in the book is on the table.
Got it.
So.
Thank you. Okay. Be happy to open this up for some questions. I think if you just step to the microphone right here in the front, And we have a winner. Go ahead, and please keep your questions short, tight, no speeches, and actually ask a question.
Aw.
Yeah, and I will be listening.
Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. Following on something the Commandant of the Marine Corps said, changing your training. How are, well, especially the Navy and the Marine Corps, changing how they train to refocus on the high intensity, the near peer? For example, with having 3 carriers in the Pacific recently at the same time. And on the Coast Guard front, and we normally don't think of the Coast Guard in this context, we talked about mobilizing the whole nation. There were coasties at D-Day all over the place in wartime and far forward, as you say, even today, working with COCOMs. So how have all you sort of worked on that transition, training people in the TTPs and the mindset for the high intensity fight?
Well done, Sidney. For you, a very short question. So let me open it up for the panel.
First stab.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll be happy to take the first stab of it, and I'll start with a sort of a macroscopic view, and then my colleagues can take it from there. I will tell you that if you go, and this is a spectacular event at West here in San Diego, one I look forward to every single year, and so, before I go on, my compliments to everybody, the Naval Institute and FCA for putting this on. It's just world class. There's another one called ITSEC, and it goes and it's concentrated around technologies that render environments, and if you're a gamer, you know what I'm talking about in terms of the realistic environments that technology can create these days. And if you think you're not a gamer, then you're probably in denial. The reality of that is that if you take a sailor, there's a couple of things. One, this Navy the nation needs is going to require different skill sets than the ones that our sailors have today. And so we've got to be mindful about creating those skill sets. We're just around the corner from a world with no drivers, right? Machines are going to be driving. So what are we going to do with sailors who were trained to drive? We have to be out in front of that problem and give them new skills. And then the technology to teach them those skills, educate and training those skills into them is different. Using some of these terrific environments to not only create terrific technology, to not only create a very realistic environment, a prototypically difficult environment, but also to measure their performance through that scenario, if you will, and feedback. So it's this idea of measurement and feedback that really allows teams to learn faster. And so we also must be mindful that as good as it gets, it can only take you so far, and at some point you just have to get salt water under the keel and get out and do it. But those technologies can take us a lot further down that path than they used to be able to preserve those training opportunities at sea for only those skills that we need to learn at sea. And I think each of the services is sort of adopting that approach to one extent or another.
Commandants?
On the land, if we're ashore, we've gone from fighting an insurgency against an adversary who had no indirect fire, no long-range precision, no ability to affect our comms, to an adversary, or at least the way we simulate it, that has these things. Yeah. The way that many of the more experienced people in here were raised back in the 80s, and I know I was. So, you're an artillery unit, you're going to get 2 missions off, you got to move. You're going to have to move your command post. You're going to have to operate at night. You're going to have to worry about your electromagnetic signature. You're not going to be able to turn on your radios, or you're going to have to do burst transmission, or you're going to deny your comms. We're going to say you're not going to operate. Or you're just going to deliberately figure out another way, not to go back to the Stone Age of messengers and flags and whistles and cymbals and trumpets, but those are hard to jam. And that's why they were used. But so, and I think a lot of it is just getting everybody to pay attention and realize that the game has changed. For now, the first time we flew a quadcopter over a Marine unit in an urban lane against a live adversary, they kind of looked up and didn't know what to do. Now they know what to do because they know that that quadcopter could be delivering munitions against them. Right. So we're working on it. I would say at sea, I think Pac Fleet's probably the most aggressive in dealing with all the formations that cross, that they're going to what you would call MCON. Yeah. Navy's teaching us all about tactic, can I be seen, can I be targeted, am I seen, am I not seen, am I seen, can I be targeted? So you're aware of the fact that you're not just out there sailing across the open ocean, that you've got to be aware that you're being surveilled, you could be being targeted, and what are you going to do to mitigate that? So whether it's reduce your signature, whether it's use decoys or use undersea capabilities, all those things that the CNO talked about. So there's a lot going on because
On both oceans.
on both oceans. So I mean, I think everywhere we're thinking about that because we realize that the adversary we had in the 80s went away, and now they're back in a different shape, and we have other adversaries, and they've got game,
Yeah.
and we got to compete.
Commandant.
Well, we're great at doing exercises, and then at the end of it, we observe lessons. We call it lessons learned, but we keep observing the same lessons over and over again. So there's an advantage right there with our exercise regimes, and then how do you actually implement some of those gaps that you've identified during these particular exercises. We got to see firsthand when you lose complete communications when we had a surge force in Puerto Rico. In isolated communities, and then a loss of confidence in the local government and then even in our federal government as well. So we've seen what it's like to operate in a communications-deprived environment. Then there are these other things I call predictable surprises. We interact with the public every day, and sometimes it's using warning shots and up to including deadly force, mostly in our counter-drug missions. When we looked at what was happening in Ferguson, Missouri, and we have a use of force training, and I've gone through it a number of times, and you pretty much have the scenarios memorized. And you know at some point someone's going to pull out a hidden gun, you shoot them before they shoot you. We had to change it. So we overhauled our use of force training policy so you can't game the system anymore. You're operating in a very dynamic environment. You can't call the boss to say, should I shoot or not shoot? It's your decision to make. Because make no mistake, you do not want to find yourself on the front fold of the Washington Post that you're using excessive force against U.S. citizens. It's one thing if it's against a foreign adversary, but if it's a U.S. citizen. So we're trying to look at what are those other predictable surprises, and let's not be caught by surprise and fix something after we were embarrassed because it was broken in the first place. But I think more importantly is implement those lessons learned.
Thanks. Megan, are you up?
Hi, gentlemen. Megan Eckstein, U.S. Naval Institute News. I wanted to ask the three of you about this idea of wholeness that we've been hearing a bit about in the budget process. I know the Navy has a wholeness readiness review that they're implementing for POM 20, but I was just wondering with the budget that's about to come out next week, kind of where you assess your wholeness in terms of the training and the maintenance dollars to go along with your programs and where you can improve in the next couple budget cycles.
We'll just go 1, 2, 3 right here if we can.
We've been getting sharper and sharper definition of this wholeness concept over the years. I would say that the 18 budget represents a pretty whole budget, right? Particularly when it comes to funding those accounts that sometimes are not as visible but very important in terms of maintaining readiness. And so it funds readiness to really the maximum that is either required or executable. 2019 continues in that, and so when that budget is delivered, one of the things that you can anticipate is that it will be informed by this strategic direction that we are talking about. It will be consistent with the dimensions of the Navy the nation needs, which is a tribute to the team that pulled it all together. I really am proud of those folks, which includes the fleets, because they really have the much better sight picture on particularly that readiness dimension and what is needed, what is most effective. And then them collaborating with the artists that pull this budget together and do all those trade-offs and submit it. Starts with the strategic direction, brings that collaborative team together, makes those tough trade-offs, and delivers a budget that's pretty whole, pretty balanced.
Commandant Neller?
I mean, there is an advantage to getting a lot of money because some of the trades you have to make, for example, the first thing that usually goes is facility maintenance.
Yep.
And And we've had a lot of good luck with facility maintenance for the past few years, but you're never going to be on top of the wave on that. 65% of our budget goes to pay our salaries, so we've got to take care of our people and our force, like all the other services. That there's a certain expectation that you're going to have a decent place to live and it's going to be safe, and you're going to have certain things that come with being a member of the military, good medical care, et cetera. So all those things are part of it. I mean, I think when people look at the budget, the first thing they look at is the big ticket items, whether they be the cost of an aircraft or a ship or a submarine or an icebreaker and all that. But I think the fact that if we get a more robust funding profile, these other things that never go away, that are part of the infrastructure and the way we run the business, they're going to get taken care of also. They're not going to get fixed entirely. But, there are still, we're always chasing ourselves on the infrastructure. And then when you buy a new system like F-35, you can't operate that thing in an old hangar. You got to buy a hangar, it requires certain capabilities in a hangar. So I mean, we're expensive, and we're expensive because we're good. Now, our job at the other end, as the CNO mentioned, is we've got to use that money wisely and efficiently. And I think we're in a good path. I know there's some concern about some of the people that come in the building, but I can tell you I find it quite refreshing to deal with DepSec Def Shanahan, Miss Lord at AT&L, and our own service secretary, Secretary Spencer, because they take a very different view. They take a business view, and then they're asking us some really hard questions. They're asking really hard questions about, okay, what did you get out of that money? What value did we get out of it? How did you spend that money? And how come, tell me about this and tell me about that. And it's forcing us to be, I think, in a positive way, more introspective and analytical about what we're doing and the processes we're using and how we spend this money so we can get the maximum benefit out of it.
In fact, for everybody in industry, Secretary Gertz is down here in the front, ASN RDA, and I just advise you all, in fact, I really impel you to just flash mob him after this thing. Just come up. He's a fountain of wisdom and energy.
Thanks, Hondo. Commandant Z?
Yeah, well, when I think wholeness, I think predictability. And we have enjoyed anything but predictability, which is a fundamental aspect of being ready. And maybe you don't get everything you need, but leave it to us to determine what offsets we need to be ready. Don't tell us how to ready your service, and allow us to identify where we can take some risk and to prioritize those risks that we can't not shy away from when it comes to readiness. But the biggest challenge really for all of us is that lack of predictability. We're averaging about 5.5 continuing resolutions each year for the past decade, which means roughly 55 CRs, which provides anything but predictability, which really makes it a challenge to look at wholeness.
And I think this gentleman's been waiting.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Lieutenant John Thomas, Amphibious Squadron 5. My question is regarding the F-35 and command relationships. So last October, I had the pleasure of being on board the Essex as she executed Exercise Dawn Blitz with the F-35 operation. A lot of great command relationships fostered and lessons learned and experimentation. So my question is, with this upcoming deployment to 5th Fleet, what do you intend on or foresee the relationship between, say, for example, the CAOC and the theater and the individual MU, CO, and ACE commander with regards to the F-35 and resource management and tasking?
Do you want to take a crack at that, John? Of course, we really
No, I mean, I think
combatant
it's,
commander to
I
answer
think,
that question.
they're going to sail, they get underway, they're going to chop from 3rd Fleet, 7th Fleet, they're going to check in with 5th Fleet,
Yeah.
they're going to work for ComNav-Cent, and they're going to operate there. CTF 51 will be their operational headquarters working for NavCent, and like with any other aircraft that's going to fly in the area, they're going to be on the ATO and they're going to be checking in with the CAOC. So they'll be on the reporting, so TBMCS, they'll show it, they'll be on the ATO, but they'll get a mission, but they'll be tasking unless the combatant commander changes that. So the mission will come down through the combatant commander. If it's something that's inherent resolve or something else in Iraq or Syria or even Afghanistan, just like going off a carrier, they'll get tasked. They'll be told what the task is, and they'll go fly it, and they'll come back, and it'll be on the ATO, and the KAOC will manage the airspace. Other than that, they'll continue to be operational under the OPCON of CTF 51 and NAVCENT.
Yeah.
So I don't see, now, that aircraft, I think what will happen when they get there is I think there'll be a recognition that they have a certain capability aboard a ship that they haven't had in the past, and there may be certain mission profiles that they want to do, but I'm, you know, that's up to General Votel and Admiral Aquilino. You know, our job for the Navy and the Marine Corps is to make sure that these two gentlemen over here, the MUCO and the FIBRON, that they're trained and ready, and they got the gear, and they're ready to go, and their readiness is up, and they can fulfill whatever tasking they get from the combatant command.
Yeah, just as a former two-time combatant commander, I'll tell you, think of it like a race car. These guys build the car, fuel the car, clean the car, train everything. They make it perfect, and then they just flip the keys to the combatant commander. It's really a good thing being a combatant commander. And so I thank all the service
I'll just
chiefs.
pile one thing on top of that, is that if there's a theater that is agile in terms of command and control, particularly in the naval dimension, you couldn't ask for a better theater than the CENTCOM to learn fast, adapt the C2, particularly between the Navy Marine Corps team there, to get the most out of that aircraft's potential. And I think there's going to be a lot of learning there when that starts to happen.
Yeah, and I'll close this by saying it's going to be crucial as we get into this near peer potential combat, that virtuous circle between the service chiefs and the combatant commanders has to get faster and tighter. Because if we're going to respond, as Commandant Neller says, to opponents who have an entirely more sophisticated panoply of capabilities, that circle has to move very, very fast. Over here.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Admiral Stavridis, you written articles that compared the trajectory we are on with cyber to that which that got us an Air Force. Do you still hold that we're on that trajectory? And then to the panel, do you see that trend, and do you welcome it, cyber as a service?
Yeah, we actually had this question, I think last year or maybe the year before. And unless any of the service chiefs have changed their opinion, I don't think they think we're on a trajectory for a cyber service. No head nods there. So in the interest of time, I'll just stipulate that they are not in favor of it. I continue to be in favor of it. I think over time, in 50 years, 100 years, we'll look back and say, what were we thinking not to have a cyber service? But there are powerful arguments on keep it within the current services as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The only thing I'd say, Admiral, I mean,
Yeah,
I think
please.
even though there are service components to Cybercom, I mean, in the aggregate, I think we are building, whether you want to call it a cyber service, we're building a cyber capability.
Nice point.
And I think, so how we organize that force and how we aggregate it, I think the general effect is we want to have a capability available to the Department of Defense and to the nation that does that. And I think everything in there is evolving. I mean, we're to the point now, if you make it through all the wickets and you become a cyber marine, if you will, and you're qualified to do mission protection or attack or cyber mission force stuff, once you get, you're not leaving. You're going to be like in SOCOM. You're in, you're a special
SOCOM
mission,
is the motto.
we're done. And because it just doesn't make sense from a business case to then take you after 2 years and then send you off to do something else, unless you want to, unless you need a break. And we can't afford to keep these people. The only thing we can give them is, hey, I'm going to leave you alone and let you do your job. And hopefully that and some enough resources to provide a bonus like we would to anybody else in a high density high density, low demand, very difficult, very technical, very challenging MOS. That'll be enough to give us enough aggregate capability. But the force is growing, and I think all of us are looking for people that have that capability, and we'll do what we can to get them trained and get them out there so they can operate in defense of the nation.
Yeah, well said.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm Lieutenant Alan Cummings from US Southcom. I think it's fair to say, as you referenced in one of the previous questions, that the bulk of our man, train, and equip functions are meant to provide ARG-MUs and the CSG to the combatant commanders. There are alternative constructs such as the Surface Action Group and the Company Landing Team, but the carrier remains our maritime king of battle. So if we are to go to war in, let's say, 2025 against the peer adversaries, will those formations be our formations of choice? And is that the right tool, or is it the tool we have available? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll just start because you need to catch up in your reading a little bit. We're actually moving to force structures well beyond strike groups and traditional ARG-MUs. Admiral Alexander over here has commanded surface action groups from 3rd Fleet deep into the Western Pacific. We've done the same thing in the Navy Marine Corps teaming in terms of aggregation and disaggregation of forces. And so I think that it's a pretty adaptable force. A lot of times we're sort of, characterized as being stodgy, and certainly everybody strives for more agility. There's no question about that. But if you think of the adaptations that we have made over a relatively short period of time, in some cases transforming an amazingly complex and large force, I challenge you to look through history and find a more agile and adaptive organization than the U.S. Armed Forces. And so that comes to bear here in the maritime forces, and we're starting to look at a lot of those more creative force structures to adapt to the environment.
Thank you. I would add, if you look at the hurricane response, you see effectively humanitarian action groups that come together with Coast Guard ships, with Navy ships, with Marines operating, as well as the other services, all coming together very adaptively. So I think you will see that kind of agility. It'll only increase. We have time for.
Let me just.
Please, Paul.
Since the CNO said he needed to read more books, read the book Anti-Fragile. It's on my reading list. So look up Commandant Coast Guard reading list, Anti-Fragile. But it talks about the larger you are, the harder you fall. So if you consolidate all of your forces, you become a consolidated target at the same time. And he's used multiple examples of a more disaggregated approach provides actually greater resiliency than if you do a concentration of forces as well. It's a really pretty compelling read, and so I'd really commend it to any of you as you start looking at how do we need to think about approaching this future environment that we're in.
Thank you, Commandant. And got time for one more
Probably
question.
the last time the lieutenant will ever ask a question. You got sort of like 3 homework assignments. And I'll take a book report on that Anti-Fragile book there, Lieutenant. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is James Harkins. I'm a retired Marine Corps Sergeant Major. My question goes to nuts and bolts. With the dwindling population eligible to enlist in the armed services, how, with the Navy looking at 350 ships, the Marine Corps having a whole bunch of empty boat spaces out there in the real world, how are we anticipating filling all of these empty spaces that you might have for your 350 ships and to fulfill your obligation for all of the divisions that you need real people in? I leave that one. Coast Guard, you're not going to have a problem. Everybody's dying to join the Coast Guard. I leave that with you folks.
Well, Sergeant Major, I'm not sure I agree with your assessment. I mean, I was talking to a bunch of recruiters that are going to recruiter school. We got 3 or 4 young men or women that want to be a Marine officer for every spot we got. I got people backed up in the delayed entry pool to be Marines that are at least 9 months deep. Every unit in the Marine Corps is manned at between 95 and 100%. So I'm not sure what holes you're talking about. So are there, now that's on paper, so we got people off doing a lot of different things. So every unit that goes out, every unit that deploys, every unit that's forward deployed is manned at darn near 100% of their table of organization. So we are this year, any re-enlistment, we got first term enlistment and we got career enlistment. We're already at 80% and we got about 6 months left to go. So it's all filling up. So I'm not sure what problem you want me to solve.
With the Navy and the Marine Corps in the non-deployables and others filling those slots to fill those deployable positions, with the dwindling population, with the jobs getting more and more better in the economy, I see this dwindling force. You say, and I agree with you, you've got a great police system, General, but the problem is these police are going to be drawn away into the civilian world as the economy gets better. With the requirements of you and the Navy for 350 ships and us for the Marine Corps, I'm having a problem grasping the manpower.
I think we're all concerned. It's a strategic issue for the nation that probably depends on what data. Admiral Stavridis probably knows, but probably less than 30% of the young men and women in this country are qualified because of physical, mental, or legal or morality issues to join, let alone have a propensity to join.
20%.
So it's a problem, and that's something we all ought to be concerned about because it affects our schools, it's affected by our schools and money we put toward education and things like that. So in the near term, long term, I share your concern, but I think you're talking about a force of 2 million out of a nation of 350 million. It's kind of important. That's why we maintain our population flow, that we allow people that are qualified and are legal to come into our country, just like all of us came into this country from our ancestors at one time. So I think that's a concern, and there is competition out there to recruit because of business and the economy. But so far we're making it, but we're watching it, and I share your concern.
I'll tell you what. Let me just address it because. And I hate to get into the middle of this Marine thing, but
Oh no, you have cross-decking, sir. So
Yeah, sir,
Let me
your
just say- let me s-
airtime is done.
Yeah, let me say this, that what's really remarkable is, the Commandant described it very accurately. We've also in the Navy met our recruiting goals for more than 10 years running. And you've got to think about why that is. And we can't compete on salary, right? Just can't do that. And oh, by the way, not only are we going to pay you less, but we are going to demand some pretty significant sacrifices out of each of our service members, and there's plenty of them here. And so I'm just speaking to you. And I'm convinced that the reason we continue to fill our ranks, the other thing before I go on, our Navy and Marine Corps is about as talented a force as it has ever been by every measure of human talent, right? Whether that's grades, test scores, physical fitness, you name it. So why do these young people come and continue to raise their right hand and swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States? I think it's the values that we offer, right? This is a noble profession. And values such as honor, courage, and commitment matter to young people today. The chance to be something bigger than themselves, to serve a higher cause. And so the Commandant, all of us up here on stage, including Admiral Stavridis, spend a great deal of time making sure that we have our moral compass set at true north and that our behaviors as an organization match our values as a profession, so that there's no say-do mismatch. Because from your time in service, as soon as that happens, the smart folks are going to leave first, right? And so as long as we continue to keep our fix, stay on course, continue to offer that organization that has this value proposition, I think we'll continue to fill our ranks.
Well said. And now our time has come. I do want to draw a line under something the Commandant just said about immigration, because I believe firmly that immigration helps this country, and it will be part of the solution to what the Sergeant Major brought up recently. And I'll give you a fact, and it's a sad fact, but it's one worth knowing. In the terrible collision of the Fitzgerald, of the 7 sailors who died, 4 of them were born outside of the United States. We can do this in this country, and I think CNO's last comments about why people want to be part of the kind of services that are led by Admiral Z, General Neller, and my very good friend, Admiral John Richardson. We had to give them a tremendous round of applause for inspiring that kind of service.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
That was fabulous.
No.
Good.
Gentlemen, thank you again for your candor and the insights that you've provided us. I think you gave us a good perspective of the way ahead and the challenges that we face in the future. And just so you know, I mentioned this before, but along with the Office of Naval Intelligence, we're going to be conducting a top secret SCI threat symposium in Chantilly on the 1st of March to address the maritime threat and the challenges that we're faced going forward. And again, on behalf of AFCEA and the United States Naval Institute, I want to present you with these books in appreciation for, once again, a very insightful and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Bob. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
And by the way, the name of that book was Great Powers, Grand Strategies, The New Game in the South China Sea by Anders Kaur. Thank you very much.